Model Test 5 section.
The listening section tests your ability to understand spoken English that is typical of interactions and academic speech on college campuses. During the test, you will listen to conversations, lectures, and discussions, and you will answer questions about them. This is the long format for the listening section. On the long format, you will listen to 3 conversations, 3 lectures, and 3 discussions. After each listening passage, you will answer 5 to 6 questions about it. Only 2 conversations, 2 lectures, and 2 discussions will be graded. The other passages are part of an experimental section for future tests. Because you will not know which conversations, lectures, and discussions will be graded, you must try to do your best on all of them. You will hear each passage one time. You may take notes while you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Choose the best answer for multiple-choice questions. Follow the directions on the page or on the screen for computer-assisted questions. Click on Next and then on OK to go on to the next question. You cannot return to previous questions. The listening section is divided into sets. Each set includes 1 conversation, 1 lecture, and 1 discussion. You have 10 minutes to answer all of the questions for each set. You will have 30 minutes to answer all of the questions on the long format. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to complete your answers for the section. The clock does not count the time you are listening to the conversations, lectures, and discussions.
Listening 1, Professor's Office.
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and a professor.
Professor Collins, I'm really sorry. These are my daughters. They're twins. I wouldn't ordinarily bring them to an appointment, but the babysitter didn't show up, and I couldn't leave them. I didn't want to cancel. I hope it's okay.
It's okay. I have 3 kids of my own, and I've been in the same situation.
Thanks. Well, this shouldn't take much of your time. I really just have one question.
All right.
I'm having a problem understanding the difference between declarative memory and procedural memory. I think from my notes that they're both examples of, let me see. I have it down here. Declarative and procedural memory are 2 broad types of memory circuits in long-term memory.
That's right, but you need to distinguish between them.
Exactly.
Okay, well, declarative memory is a memory that links us to a fact, like a name or a date or even an experience.
So when I remember a professor's name when I see him, that's declarative memory?
Yes, at its most basic level it is. But declarative memory also includes problem solving. Like today, when you decided to bring your daughters to my office, you were using declarative memory to access previous experiences and facts that would allow you to make a decision.
Oh, right. I remember your example in class. That makes sense now. You were talking about problem solving by recalling experiences. But wasn't that episodic memory?
Very good. Yes, it's called episodic memory. But declarative memory includes episodic memory, which is the ability to access prior experiences or personal episodes in our life, usually for the purpose of making a decision or solving a problem. So episodic memories, subcategories in our life, usually for the purpose of making a decision or solving a problem. So episodic memory is a subcategory of declarative memory, so to speak. And semantic memory is just the storehouse of facts that we have in our memory circuits.
Which is also a subcategory of declarative memory?
Precisely.
Okay, then procedural memory doesn't include facts or experiences.
Not directly, no. Procedural memory refers to skills that we've learned and are now remembering in order to perform the skill without really thinking much about it. Like, for example, riding a bike, or do you play a musical instrument?
Piano, sort of. Not really.
Okay. Well, when you ride a bike then, you aren't thinking about the name of every part of the bike and how to use the handlebars or the pedals, or at least not consciously.
No.
But at some level, you are remembering how to do these things, so you're using your memory.
And that'd be procedural memory.
Yes, it would.
Okay, then. That's why you said that declarative memory can be more rapidly learned, but it can also be more rapidly forgotten. Because a fact can come and go in the memory. but procedural memory takes repetition and practice, so it's harder to unlearn. I'm not saying that very well.
But you have the idea. Often with declarative memory, you're consciously trying to remember, but with procedural memory, you're performing a skill without consciously trying to recall how, without each step in the process.
That's what I mean, but...
Yes?
Well, I was thinking about language when my girls were learning to talk.
Oh, I see where you're going. You want to know whether language learning is declarative or procedural.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I was thinking that maybe it's both, because you have to memorize vocabulary, but eventually it's more like a skill, like riding a bike, because you don't think about each individual word. It's more automatic. Do you see what I mean?
A very good analysis. I think you've got this.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
And if you ever need to ask me a question and it's hard to get in to see me, just drop me an email.
I thought about that, but...
Look, I'm always glad to see you, but I answer a lot of questions like this by email every day. And if it's easier for you, that's fine with me.
That's very kind of you. Thank you so much.
1. Why does the woman go to see her professor? Two. What do semantic memory and episodic memory have in common? 3. When the professor gives the example of riding a bicycle, what kind of memory is he referring to? 4. Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
Do you see what I mean?
A very good analysis. I think you've got this.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
What does the student mean when she says this?
Do you see what I mean?
5. What does the professor suggest?
Listening to History class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
Frontier home design in the United States was greatly influenced by the provisions of the Homestead Act of 1862. The legislation gave settlers the right to open land, but mandated that homesteaders build a structure that was at least 10 by 12 feet and included at least one glass window. And they had to live on their homestead and improve the land for 5 years before their claim was recognized. Of course, when they first arrived, most homesteaders lived in their wagons or pitched tents until they filed claims and planted crops. And even then, knowing that fully half of the homesteaders wouldn't make it through the 5 years required to complete their claims, homesteaders tended to view the construction of their homes as semi-permanent dwellings. More likely, they'd build something better later or try to improve on what they'd built initially if they made it through the first 5 years. So, in addition to the requirements in the Homestead Act, the settlers needed a home that was easy to build, cheap, and maybe even disposable. Well, the log cabin's the construction that comes to mind when we think of Western settlements. But the plains and the prairies had so few trees that log construction was almost impossible. So the sod house was a practical solution for homesteaders on flat, treeless land. So how do you build a sod house? Well, first you wait for a rain that makes the earth soft. Then you use a sod cutter to form sod bricks about 2 or 3 feet square and a few inches thick. Then you stack the bricks to form walls and weave branches or twigs and grass into a roof that's finally covered with sod as well. Now, there were tremendous advantages to this type of construction. In the first place, it was very cheap. There are journals from the 1800s that document construction prices at about $2.50, and most of that was for the glass window. And it took very little time to build, probably a day or two, and the thick walls actually kept the house quite cool in the summer and fairly warm in the winter. If a better home could be built later, the sod house would simply dissolve into the soil. But there were serious disadvantages as well. Even well-built roofs leaked onto the dirt floors, forming mud puddles, and sometimes the roof even collapsed from the water weight. Or in dry spells, the dirt crumbled from the roof into the home, not to mention the infestations of insects and even snakes that inhabited the dirt walls. So those settlers who arrived in wooded areas opted to build log cabins instead of sod homes. Like the sod construction, the log cabin could be built in a few days using simple tools, often only an axe. But it was much more comfortable. There's evidence that the first log cabins were introduced by Swedish settlers as early as the 1700s, but other immigrant settlers quickly adopted the construction. First, you build a foundation of rocks to keep the logs away from dampness that might cause them to rot. Then you cut down the trees and square off the logs, cutting notches in the top and bottom of each end so they could fit together when they were stacked at the corners. And it also had the advantage of assuring structural integrity. And there were several types of notching techniques that were used, depending on the skill of the builder. In any case, with notching, no nails were required. And that was good, since nails had to be shipped into towns and then transported out to the new settlements. But there were gaps in the walls, so these had to be filled by a technique called chinking. In chinking, grass, hay, moss, and mud were worked into rolls about a foot long and maybe 4 inches wide, and then they were inserted into the cracks between the logs. These rolls were commonly referred to as mudcats and were very effective in keeping out the cold and keeping in the heat. Of course, the tighter the logs, the fewer chinks were required, and that's important because the chinks were the weakest part of the cabin. And with the expansion and contraction that resulted from freezing and thawing, well, chinking tended to deteriorate and needed constant maintenance and repair. Okay, there was usually a stone or brick fireplace along one wall, and the roof was usually made of wood shingles. So you can imagine this was quite an improvement over the sod house. The advantages were that the home could be kept clean. Even though the floor was usually dirt or gravel because flat boards were difficult to obtain, it was still an effective shelter to keep out the rain and dust. Later, at the end of the 1800s, when the railroads brought materials such as asphalt shingles, tar paper, and finished boards to the frontier, the sod house was abandoned for one-room board shanties covered with tar paper. Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate. For one thing, since they were often built without foundations, the harsh winds of the prairies literally blew the shanties away. Still, many settlers considered the shacks preferable to the old soddies, even though they weren't as easy to heat and cool. To go back to the log cabin for a minute, the effect of new construction materials on the log cabin was aesthetic, as well as practical. The logs were often covered on the outside by finished boards and on the inside with plaster, which gave the cabins a more finished look and improved insulation. And by this time, the old one-room 10 by 12 was also being replaced with larger homes with several rooms. The frontier settlers had weathered the hardships of their first 5 years. They'd received their claims, and they and their homes were a permanent part of the great Western expansion.
6. What is the lecture mainly about? Seven. How does the professor organize his lecture? 8. What does the professor imply about construction materials for early homes? 9. What is the evidence for the inexpensive price of a sod home? 10. Listen again to part of the lecture, and then answer the following question.
Later, at the end of the 1800s, when the railroads brought materials such as asphalt shingles, tar paper, and finished boards to the frontier, the sod house was abandoned for one-room board shanties covered with tar paper. Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate.
Why does the professor say this?
Whether this was an improvement is subject to debate.
(11) In the lecture, the professor identifies attributes for different frontier homes. Indicate whether each attribute refers to a sod house or a log cabin. Click in the correct box for each phrase.
Listening 3, Geology class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a geology class.
The exploitation of minerals involves 5 steps. First, you have to explore and locate the mineral deposits. Then you set up a mining operation. Next, you must refine the raw minerals and transport the refined minerals to the manufacturer.
Excuse me, sorry, I only have 4 steps. Could you...
Oh, sure. That's exploration, mining, refining, transportation, and manufacturing.
Thanks.
So, each of these activities involves costs. There are costs associated with them, and the costs can be economic, but not necessarily so. Mineral exploitation also has environmental costs associated with it. For example, the exploration stage will clearly have a high economic cost because of personnel and technology, but the environmental cost will probably be quite low. Now, why would that be, do you think?
Because you aren't actually disturbing the environment, you're just looking. I mean, after you find a mineral deposit, you don't do anything about it at that stage.
Right, so the environmental cost would be low. But what happens when you use up all the resources that are easy to find? Then what?
Then the costs go up for exploration.
Which costs?
Well, probably both of them. But I can see where the economic costs would increase.
Okay. Let's say, for example, that some areas such as national parks or historic reserves have been off limits to exploration. What'll happen when we use up the minerals outside of these areas? Remember now that these are non-renewable resources that we're looking for.
Then there'll be a lot of pressure, to open up these areas to exploration and exploitation.
Probably so. And that means that there could be a high environmental cost. Any other options?
Find an alternative.
Yes, you're on the right track.
Okay, find an alternative. A substitute, something that'll substitute for the mineral. Maybe something man-made?
Good. That'll involve a different kind of exploration, again with economic costs. I'm talking about basic research here to find synthetics. But let's go on to the other steps and we'll see if we can pull this all together. How about mining? Now, we're looking at high environmental costs because of the destruction of the landscape and the accumulation of waste products that have to be dealt with. Air and water pollution is almost always a problem. Any ideas on refining?
Wouldn't it be the same as mining? You'd have high costs because of labor and equipment, and there'd be problems of waste and pollution, like you said.
True. And in refining, well, that often involves the separation of a small amount of a valuable mineral from a large amount of surrounding rock. So that means that refining also carries the additional cost of cleanup. And don't forget that it's often difficult to get vegetation to grow on piles of waste. In fact, some of it, the waste piles, they can even be dangerous to living creatures, including people, not to mention the appearance of the area. So the environmental costs can be extremely high. Isn't it sad and ironic that so much of the mining and refining must take place in areas of great natural beauty?
So you're saying that both mining and refining have heavy costs, heavy economic and environmental costs.
Right. And in both mining and refining, you'd need transportation to support the movement of supplies, equipment, and personnel. But after the minerals are mined and refined, then transportation becomes even more essential.
And I was just thinking that in addition to the economic costs of the transportation for trucks and fuel and labor and everything, there might be some construction too, if there aren't any roads in or out of the area.
And that would mean?
That would mean that the landscape and even the ecosystem for the plants and animal life could be altered. So that's an environmental cost.
It is indeed. Good point. That leaves us with manufacturing. After we find it, mine it, refine it, and transport it, we still have to manufacture it. What are the costs associated with that? Well, construction again for factories. Then there'd be energy costs, technology, and labor.
So all that's economic. No environmental costs in manufacturing, then?
Well, yes, there are, actually. Pollution's often a costly problem for manufacturing plants.
Oh, right. I was thinking of the natural landscape, and the manufacturing is often positioned near cities to take advantage of the labor pool. But cities have the environmental problems associated with pollution. So every step has both economic and environmental costs then.
Right.
12. What is this discussion mainly about? (13) According to the professor, what are two problems that can be anticipated when roads are cut into an area for mining? (14) Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
And I was just thinking that in addition to the economic costs of the transportation for trucks and fuel and labor and everything, there might be some construction too, if there aren't any roads in or out of the area.
And that would mean?
Why does the professor say this?
And that would mean?
15. What option is proposed as an alternative when all of the mineral resources in easily accessible locations have been depleted? (16) What does the professor imply about the environmental costs of mineral exploitation? 17. What does the professor want the students to do in this class session?
Listening 4. Professor's Office.
Listen to part of a conversation on campus between a student and a professor.
Hi, I'm Ron Watson. I'm here to apply for the work-study job.
Oh, good. Have you ever had a work-study position?
Not really. To tell the truth, I'm not exactly sure how it works.
Well, it's like this. On work-study, you have regular hours and assigned responsibilities. But if you get everything done, you can study. You can't leave because there may be something else to do later during your hours. But you should always bring your books and I guess that probably about 25% of the time you should be able to study.
This is even better than I thought. What kind of assignments would I have? I mean, if I get this opportunity.
Clerical mostly, I'm afraid. Nothing too demanding, but it isn't the most interesting work either. Filing, copying, delivering mail, some grading, but only multiple choice tests, and we use a grading machine for that.
Would someone show me how to operate the grading machine? I'm sure I could do it if someone showed me once or twice.
No problem. We have a secretary here in the department, and she'll be the main person you report to. She'd show you how to do everything.
Okay, great.
Now, let's see whether your hours will fit in with the hours we need. Could you work Monday through Thursday from 10 to 2?
That's 16 hours a week?
To start, we may actually want to extend that to Fridays, so if that happens, it'd be 20 hours. You'll notice that the hours include the usual lunch break. That'd let Nancy, she's the secretary, so she could get you started on the work, and then take her lunch from noon to 1 and be back for the last hour of your day, in case you had any questions.
Okay.
Oh, and I should tell you about the phone. While Nancy's gone for lunch, we'll want you to answer the phone.
Sure, I can do that. Will there be any work on the computer? I'm familiar with most of the basic office programs. I used to help my dad in his office when I was in high school. He's a lawyer.
Oh, well, we hadn't planned to include anything like that in the job, but it's a plus.
Sorry to ask, but how does the pay work? Do I get paid for the time I work minus the study time, or...
Oh, no. You get paid for 16 hours a week whether you're working or studying. This is a special program for students.
It seems too good to be true.
Well, you need to have an interview with Nancy. Since you'll be working closely with her, she'll make the final decision.
Okay. Should I make an appointment, or...
No, just go over to her desk and tell her who you are. She's expecting you. We want to get the position filled as soon as possible.
Well, thank you for seeing me. I hope I'll be working here.
Good luck. Oh, yes. Be sure to tell Nancy about the computer experience.
I will.
And let her know I've already interviewed you and I referred you to her.
Thanks again. I really appreciate your taking the time to explain everything to me.
You're welcome.
18. Why does the student go to the professor's office? (19) Listen again to part of the conversation and then answer the following question.
What kind of assignments would I have? I mean, if I get this opportunity.
Clerical mostly, I'm afraid. Nothing too demanding, but it isn't the most interesting work either.
What does the professor mean when she says this?
Clerical mostly, I'm afraid.
(20) What experience does the man have that may be helpful? (21) What is the pay for the work-study position? (22) What can we assume about the meeting?
Listening 5, Music Appreciation Class.
Listen to part of a lecture in a music appreciation class.
As you know, tonight's the concert that I want you to attend, so I'll keep the class short today. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of chamber music, so you'll be prepared to appreciate the music that you hear tonight. The University Quartet is one of the best in the region, so you'll be hearing an excellent example. Anyway, about chamber music. From medieval times through the 18th century, musicians in Europe had basically two options for employment: the church or the nobility. So, when they weren't creating pieces for religious occasions and performing at church functions, musicians were playing in the chambers of stately homes. Now, a chamber is the name for a room where guests may be assembled, kind of like a hall. And because of their association with this room, this chamber, the musicians who played for the wealthy patrons came to be known as chamber players. Chamber music is written to be performed by a relatively small group, more than one, but fewer than a dozen musicians. I should tell you that pieces for more than 8 players are unusual, though, and it's very rare to see a conductor. It may surprise you to know that any combination of instruments can be used for chamber music. The strings, woodwinds, and piano are so often associated with chamber music, and, they remain the most popular even today, but chamber music has been written for other instruments as well. Well, the history of chamber music is usually divided into 3 distinct periods. In the classical period, and that extends from the mid-1700s to around 1820. So, in the classical period, chamber music, like many other expressions of the arts, it reacted to the extravagant Baroque style by creating new structures. And these structures expressed simplicity, balance, and order. It was the age of the Enlightenment, with the ideals of logic and reason. So, this translated into compositions with one melodic line. The line, the melody, it was usually written for the violin, and all other instruments provided an accompaniment. Early chamber music in the classical tradition often included the recorder, the harpsichord, and the viola. Vienna was a hub of activity for chamber music, and 3 composers dominated the artistic scene. Franz Joseph Haydn is generally credited with organizing the string quartet, and he produced more than 80 pieces for it, the quartet. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart also composed chamber music, including not only quartets, but also quintets and trios with clarinet, and even piano sonatas. Since the music was relatively simple, many amateurs played for their own enjoyment. This was new, but by then, music was being printed, and more people had access to it. So music rooms became popular, and people played chamber music as a social activity. Well, it was Ludwig von Beethoven who probably bridged between the classical period and the Romantic period. And I say that because his works were longer and perhaps more complex than his predecessors. And I find this amazing, since the later quartets were all created when he was totally deaf. In any case, composers and performers were beginning to break free of the formal confines of the classical period. Their works became increasingly more difficult, expressing some of the high emotions of the 19th century, which, as you will recall, the backdrop of that century, the French and the American revolutions, they were defining moments. So Chopin, Liszt, and Wagner wrote very little chamber music because they preferred the emotional power of the full orchestra or the personal expression in a piano solo. It was also at about this time that Franz Schubert, Johannes Brahms, Felix Mendelssohn, and Antonin Dvorak made their contributions, and they wrote melodic, passionate compositions for chamber players. But now the music was more difficult to play, and the patronage system was declining anyway, so most chamber music moved from the great homes of the wealthy and into the concert halls, which were frequented by a growing middle class. And it was a very creative period for chamber music, and professional chamber groups emerged during this time. The composers probably felt a new freedom because they weren't so much pressed to please their patrons, and they could explore their art. Well, at the turn of the century, the modern period ushered in an opportunity for even greater experimentation. Painters were bringing Impressionism to the forefront of the artistic consciousness, and this was reflected musically in the work of Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel. Their chamber music was considered revolutionary, Debussy and Ravel, because, unlike previous composers, their compositions had recurring themes instead of a continuous melody. And there are a number of other composers who wrote chamber music in the modern period, but whether they'll be remembered is, well, a question to be answered by future historians. What we do know is that the modernists gave chamber music new combinations of instruments and arrangements. And as the music became more unexpected, often with unusual tonality, well, it also became even more difficult to play. And that meant that the scores for modern chamber music had to be played by very skilled ensemble musicians. This evening, at the concert, the University Quartet will perform one of the classical pieces by Haydn. You'll hear the Quartet in D minor, Opus 76, Number 2, third movement. There are 2 violins, 1 cello, and 1 viola. So, that said, I'll see you tonight.
23. What is the main purpose of the lecture? 24. What is the origin of the term chamber music? 25. Which of the following are the key characteristics of chamber music in the classical period? 26. Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Well, it was Ludwig von Beethoven who probably bridged between the classical period and the Romantic period. And I say that because his works were longer and perhaps more complex than his predecessors. And I find this amazing, since the later quartets were all created when he was totally deaf.
What does the professor mean when she says this about Beethoven?
And I find this amazing, since the later quartets were all created when he was totally deaf.
"27. Why does the professor mention Impressionism? 28. How did the professor organize the lecture?
6. Botany class.
Listen to part of a discussion in a botany class. The professor is talking about hydroponics.
Although the recent interest in hydroponics may lead you to believe that it's a relatively new idea, the process probably originated in ancient times. In fact, the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon may well have been one of the first successful attempts to grow plants in water, that is, hydroponically. Early agriculture in Pakistan and India, as well as other areas throughout the Middle East, included water crops. And we also have evidence that the Egyptians were growing plants in water along the Nile, and that was without soil. Asia and the South Pacific were prime locations for early hydroponic gardens, and in the Western Hemisphere, we know that the Aztecs had developed an advanced system of water agriculture along the marshlands of Lake Tenochtitlan in the Central Valley of Mexico, because when the Spanish arrived, they made drawings in their journals of floating islands of trees and vegetation. In other words, hydroponic agriculture. Okay, well, this isn't a history class. It's a botany class, but I think it's important when we're talking about scientific discoveries that we understand how science works. Sometimes we're rediscovering and refining methods that have been used for a very long time, and that's certainly the case of hydroponics. Through the years, it's been called nutriculture, chemiculture, aquaculture, soilless culture, but the current term is hydroponics. And that encompasses the modern science of growing plants without soil by using an inert medium, such as sand, peat, gravel, or even sawdust or styrofoam. Of course, you have to add a solution of nutrients. Clearly, good soil has the nutrients necessary for plant growth, but when plants are grown without soil, all the nutrients must be provided in another way. So, why do you think that we'd go to all of this additional effort to replace soil?
Well, I think the book mentioned something about keeping the growing medium more sterile.
Soil-borne diseases and pests and even weeds can be virtually eliminated by using a soil alternative.
So I was thinking probably you wouldn't require as much labor to get rid of the pests and weeds.
Good thought. Now tell me what you know about fertilizer and water.
Oh, right. Less fertilizer and water are required per plant since they're constantly reused. And aren't the results more uniform because of the highly controlled conditions?
Right on both counts. But probably the most important advantage is the ability to cultivate a larger number of plants in a limited space. Where would this be important, do you think?
Well, small or isolated environments or very arid climates with limited freshwater supplies, probably.
Or regions with poor soils, for instance, in developing countries where the weather conditions aren't dependable and famine could happen.
Or the area may have a dense population.
So hydroponics is limited to developing regions, then?
I'm not sure about that. Even in highly industrialized nations, populations are growing, and isn't the total acreage and cultivation dropping to accommodate the expansion of urban areas?
Well stated. As agricultural land is sold for development, hydroponics has become a viable option for almost every country in the world. Now, earlier, I said that we're often rediscovering ancient methods in science, but we're also adapting them by using improvements from other scientific research. In the case of hydroponics, there are probably 2 modern discoveries that have supported progress in hydroponics. Okay, first, the development of plastics that allowed growers to abandon the old concrete beds, which were costly to construct and problematic because they leached into the nutrient solution. But plastic beds are cheap, they're light and sterile, an ideal replacement for concrete. And many of the greenhouses themselves are even built of plastic panels. Okay, the other important advancements, the knowledge we've accumulated about plant nutrition. Of course, like I said, good soil has the nutrients necessary for plant growth, but when plants are grown without soil, all the nutrients must be provided in another way. And now we have a much better idea of what we need to use in the solution to obtain the best results. So, all of that said, let's talk about the lab experiment that we set up here. This solution contains potassium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, magnesium sulfate, monocalcium phosphate, and calcium sulfate. Don't try to write down all of that now. You can refer to your lab workbook for the list of substances and the proportions needed for proper plant growth. For now, just look at this diagram. The drawing in your lab workbook should look more or less like this one. As you know, for plants grown in soil, the roots absorb water and nutrients, but they also serve to anchor the plant. That's why the roots of our hydroponic plants aren't placed directly in the water and nutrient solution. We used sterile gravel, held in place by wire mesh, to anchor the plants, and that allowed us to suspend the roots in the tank below. Remember, the tank contains the water and nutrient solution. So, because oxygen's also taken in by the roots, we had to attach an air pump to mix oxygen into the solution. Remember, a constant source of oxygen is one of the major problems with hydroponics tanks of this kind. And you can see the way that the pump was attached to the tank. Okay, it's almost time for our break this morning, so I'd like you to come over to the hydroponics area and examine the experiment close up. I'd also like you to take a closer look at this specimen of nutrient solution. What do you notice about this? Can you draw any conclusions? Today's day 1 for you to record your observations on the chart in your workbook.
29. What is this discussion mainly about? (30) Why does the professor talk about the history of hydroponics? 31. According to the professor, what is the greatest advantage of hydroponics? 32. Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
Or regions with poor soils, for instance, in developing countries where the weather conditions aren't dependable and famine could happen.
Or the area may have a dense population.
So hydroponics is limited to developing regions, then?
I'm not sure about that.
Why does the professor say this?
So hydroponics is limited to developing regions, then?
"33. Why does the professor suggest that the students refer to their lab workbook? "34. According to the professor, why are roots important to plants?
Listening 7. Library.
Listen to part of a conversation between a librarian and a student.
Excuse me,
Yes?
are you the reference librarian?
Yes. How can I help you?
Well, I'm looking for a book that compares Great Britain, Australia, Canada, and the United States.
Okay. What exactly are you trying to compare?
I'm not quite sure. How about the cost of living?
Oh. Well, cost of living is, well, it's not very specific. I mean, what aspects of the cost of living do you need to find? Cost of living is a fairly broad topic.
It is?
Well, yes. Do you want this for personal information or is it for a class?
It's for my economics class
Uh-huh.
with Professor Brooks.
Oh, okay. Well, do you just need numbers or is it a report, a narrative?
Just the numbers. I'm supposed to make a chart. It can be either a pie chart or a bar graph, and I have to have some demographic information, in order to do the chart.
So you want a general comparison. I'm trying to imagine what you'll put on the graph.
Well, I'm not too clear about that. I was thinking I might make several graphs, one for each country with the cost of basic things on it, and then I could compare the graphs.
Was that the assignment? Maybe if you could explain the assignment to me.
Okay. I have it right here, somewhere. Just a minute. Okay, here it is. It says, make a pie chart or a bar graph with at least 4 parts. It should be large enough to share with the class.
That's it?
Uh-huh. But it's for an economics class, and we have to be able to explain it to everyone. So that's why I was going for the cost of living, and my major's international business, so I was interested in comparing several countries.
But the professor really only asked you for one chart.
I guess so. But I'm trying to figure out how to compare those countries on one chart, and it's not that easy.
Okay. Well,
you think I should just do the one chart then?
It's usually better to follow the instructions for an assignment, unless...
Even if it's more than the professor asked for?
It's usually better to check with the professor first, if you want to change the assignment.
Okay, then. I guess I need to choose one country and compare several factors for the one country.
Or, if you want to compare several countries, you probably need to zero in on one factor.
Yeah.
Like the average income for a family of 4, or...
Oh, I see. Maybe I could compare the cost of a home.
Right.
So I could find that in an encyclopedia then.
Well, maybe. But you want current data, and I'm not sure that you'd find demographics on income and home prices in an encyclopedia. Anyway, look, why don't I show you where you can find some reference materials in economics? Then you can browse for a while. Maybe you'll find something that sparks an idea. But if you don't, then just come back to my desk and I'll look with you.
Thanks. That's great.
35. Why does the man approach the librarian? "36. Listen again to part of the conversation and then answer the following question.
It says, make a pie chart or a bar graph with at least 4 parts. It should be large enough to share with the class.
That's it?
Uh-huh.
What does the woman mean when she says this?
That's it?
"37. What does the librarian imply? 38. What example does the librarian give for the assignment? (39) What will the man do with the information?
Listening 8. Engineering class.
Listen to part of a lecture in an engineering class.
Because every earthquake presents us with unique conditions, it's difficult to anticipate the stresses that'll ultimately affect the structures we design and build. So our challenge is to try to design a building that'll be as safe as possible for all types of earthquakes. Besides that, during the past decade, the expectations for earthquake-resistant structures have changed. Whereas in the past, it was considered adequate for a building not to collapse during an earthquake, now, insurance companies and even clients, they're demanding buildings that'll be able to maintain their structural integrity through an earthquake and remain sound after the earthquake subsides. So in recent years, we've developed several techniques for building more earthquake-resistant structures. For relatively small buildings, all we have to do, really, is bolt the buildings to their foundations and provide some support walls. Remember, these walls are referred to as shear walls in your textbook. They're made of reinforced concrete, and by that I mean concrete with steel rods embedded in it. This not only strengthens the structure, but it also diminishes the forces that tend to shake a building during a quake. And in addition to the shear walls that surround a building, shear walls can be situated in the center of a building around an elevator shaft or a stairwell. This is really an excellent reinforcement. It's commonly known as a shear core, and it contains reinforced concrete too. Okay, let's talk about walls. Walls can also be reinforced using a technique called cross-bracing. Imagine steel beams that cross diagonally from the ceiling to the floor, and this happens on each story in a building. So before the walls are finished, you can see a vertical row of steel X's on the structure. And this cross-bracing tends to make a building very rigid and consequently very strong. But besides steel reinforcements, engineers have also devised base isolators, which are positioned below the building, and their purpose is to absorb the shock of the sideways shaking that can undermine a building and cause it to collapse. Most of the base isolators that are currently being used are made of alternating layers of steel and synthetic rubber. The steel is for strength, but the rubber absorbs shock waves. In higher buildings, a moat of flexible materials allows the building to sway during seismic activity, or large rubber cylinders support all of the corners of the building and in between each floor, and they allow the building to sway during an earthquake. So you can see that these alternatives are quite different from cross-bracing or shear walls. So the combination of reinforced structures and flexible materials has been proven to reduce earthquake damage. But even these engineering techniques are insufficient if the building's been constructed on filled ground. Soil used in fill dirt can lose its bearing strength when subjected to the shock waves of an earthquake, and the buildings constructed on it can literally disappear into the earth. So in areas where earthquakes are known to occur, it's important to understand the terrain, and you have to be sure that the ground's either solid or it's been adequately prepared. Okay, let's assume that we do everything right. We choose and prepare the construction site, and we design a building with plenty of reinforcements and flexible materials. With cross-bracing, we probably have a building with the strength to hold up under earthquakes, even those of relatively high magnitudes. And while this is great for the building, what about the occupants? Well, the structure may be strong, but the furniture will probably be overturned or shifted during the earthquake, and that could result in major injuries for the people inside. So, now that we've made progress in solving the problem of how to preserve the buildings, one of the more recent areas of research is how to better protect the occupants during an earthquake. One interesting possibility is to design buildings that house a series of pistons, and these pistons are filled with fluid and controlled by sensors in a computer. So, by analyzing signals from the sensors, the computer should be able to determine the magnitude of an earthquake in progress. And when it does that, it can trigger electromagnets in the pistons to increase or decrease the rigidity of the shock absorbers built into the structure. If the earthquake's minor, then the building can be programmed to sway gently, and the people and everything else inside get a safe ride. But during high-magnitude earthquakes, the shock absorbers can freeze the building to prevent it from shaking at all. So the beauty of the concept is that the computer sensors work very quickly, reacting within 1/1000th of a second. And they can run on battery power since the electrical system usually fails during an earthquake. Will the concept work? Well, the National Science Foundation is supporting more research into the potential of pistons. And the results so far are promising.
40. What is this lecture mainly about? 41. Which technique is used to reinforce walls? 42. Which two materials are used in base isolators? 43. What happens to fill dirt during an earthquake? 44. Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
With cross-bracing, we probably have a building with the strength to hold up under earthquakes, even those of relatively high magnitudes. And while this is great for the building, what about the occupants? Well, the structure may be strong, but the furniture will probably be overturned or shifted during the earthquake, and that could result in major injuries for the people inside.
Why does the professor say this?
And while this is great for the building, what about the occupants?
"45. What does the professor think about computer sensors for buildings?
9. Art History Class.
Listen to part of a discussion in an art history class. The professor is talking about action art.
In the 1950s, abstract expressionism emerged among a group of painters that came to be known as the New York School, although the members included artists from many regions of the United States and several European countries as well. In any case, we know that the brushstrokes were a significant feature of the work of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters, and like them, the abstract expressionists were interested in the expressive qualities of paint, and particularly in the case of action painters or gesture painters. They were sometimes called gesture painters, and they developed new methods for applying the paint. They dripped, threw, sprayed, and splattered paint on the canvas with a view to expressing artistic actions or gestures as part of the creative process. Now, according to your textbook, probably the best known of the action painters was who?
Pollock?
Jackson Pollock.
No doubt about it. Pollock was a highly individual artist. He's famous for huge mural-sized works, and to create them, he'd spread his unstretched canvas on the floor, and he'd approach the work from all four sides, walking around it and attacking it with commercial house paint in cans that he carried with him. He dripped the paint from sticks or brushes that he dipped in the cans, or Or he threw the paint and splashed it in patterns that reflected the motion of his arm and his body as he engaged in his so-called action painting. I think you can see how the name applies to this method. So Pollock claimed that this process allowed him to be in the painting, not apart from it. Let me show you a picture of Pollock with a work in progress. As you can see, and this is Pollock, he's stepping right onto the canvas, splattering and dripping the paint. He's focusing on the act of painting, and he's using grand rhythmic gestures, sort of similar to a dance. In fact, some critics referred to the work as a performance or a choreographed activity. He also used to pour the paint directly out of the can, and occasionally threw sand, broken glass, pebbles and string and other objects. He'd throw them onto the canvas. So, how much of the action art was a result of decisions, and how much was pure chance? What do you think?
Well, there was probably a little bit of both going on there.
Probably so. But Pollock contended that he could control the flow of the paint with the motion of his arm and body, and that his work was not accidental. And it certainly was spontaneous in the sense that it happened very quickly, and the decisions that he made were of necessity, split-second choices. So I'd say you're right that action art, and Pollock's work in particular, is a combination of chance, of artistic intuition, and control. And I should point out that he was known to retouch a drip with a brush on occasion. Now let me show you an example of the paintings themselves. What do you see?
There's no visual center of attention.
Which means?
Which means the image has no foreground, no background, no focus of attention.
I see. However, I think you'll agree that it does have a complex unity, a balance of form and color. Look at the patterns. Wouldn't you agree that they're caused by the separation and weaving of one pigment in another? And it was this weaving that produced a number of tones from a minimal palette of paints. Have any of you ever seen an original Pollock?
I have. I went to the Guggenheim Museum when I was in New York last year.
Could you tell the class a little about it?
Sure. I thought that the work looked like skeins of yarn because the dripping and the small objects produced a
texture?
Yeah. Texture as well as form, like yarn. And I also remember the light that seemed to be in the canvas.
And precisely because of the texture and light, it's really a disservice to see this as a flat slide.
Oh, another thing. A lot of the paintings were identified by numbers instead of names.
Oh, thanks for bringing that up. Some people think he did that because he didn't want to limit the imagination. He wanted others to view a painting without prejudice, so to speak. But one piece has come to be called Lavender Mist. I'm not really sure whether Pollock actually named it or not, but it's particularly interesting because the artist marked the image with his handprints. I think it's in your textbook, but again, seeing it with the texture of the paint is a different experience. Okay, so after the process of creation, we see beauty, order, unity, perhaps even rhythm in an incredible light emanating from the canvas. Pollock wanted to express his feelings rather than to merely illustrate them, and I think he did achieve that. And whether you like them or not, and many critics argued and continue to argue their merits, but it's undeniable that works by Pollock are unique and recognizable, and virtually impossible to copy. It's also clear that he had a remarkable influence on later artists, color field painters who adapted the paint-pouring methods, and modern artists who chose to work with all-over patterns, and the performance artists who continue to push the envelope on activity and process.
46. What is this discussion mainly about? (47) To what did some critics compare Pollock's work? 48. According to the professor, what defines action art? (49) Listen again to part of the discussion, and then answer the following question.
Could you tell the class a little about it?
Sure. I thought that the work looked like skeins of yarn because the dripping and the small objects produced
Texture?
Yeah, texture as well as form, like yarn.
Why does the professor say this?
Texture?
(50) What is interesting about the painting Lavender Mist? (51) What is the professor's opinion of Pollock? Model Test 5, Speaking Section.
The speaking section tests your ability to communicate in English in an academic setting. During the test, you will be presented with 6 speaking questions. The questions ask for a response to a single question, a conversation, a talk, or a lecture. The prompts and questions are presented only one time. You may take notes as you listen, but notes are not graded. You may use your notes to answer the questions. Some of the questions ask for a response to a reading passage and a talk or a lecture. The reading passages and the questions are written, but the directions will be spoken. Your speaking will be evaluated on both the fluency of the language and the accuracy of the content. You will have 15 to 20 seconds to prepare and 45 to 60 seconds to respond to each question. Typically, a good response will require all of the response time, and the answer will be complete by the end of the response time. You will have about 20 minutes to complete the speaking section. A clock on the screen will show you how much time you have to prepare each of your answers and how much time you have to record each response.
Number 1. Listen for a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Your friend's cousin is going to visit your country, and you promised to show her some interesting places. Which one would be more interesting? 1. A beautiful landscape. 2. A historical city. 3. Your home. Use specific reasons and details to explain your choice.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 2. Listen for a question that asks your opinion about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you have 15 seconds to prepare and 45 seconds to record your answer.
Some people believe that the best way to succeed is to set goals and work hard to achieve them. Other people think that hard work is not as important as good luck. Which point of view do you think is true, and why? Use specific reasons and examples to support your opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 3. Read a short passage and listen to a talk on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
A student meeting is planned to discuss the policy for vehicle registration.
Read the policy in the college catalog.
You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to a student who is speaking at the meeting. She is expressing her opinion about the policy.
Well, I don't mind paying a parking fee, and I even think that $20 is reasonable. But my concern is that some of us are using more than one car. And since the registration's for the car, not the student, well, then you have to pay $40 so you can drive both of your cars on campus. But you're only one student. See what I mean? Like me, sometimes I have to take my husband's car, and one time last semester, I didn't have it registered and I got a ticket. I think that every student should pay a parking fee and then just put a parking permit on the windshield of whatever car the student is driving that day. Don't you?
The student expresses her opinion of the policy for vehicle registration. Report her opinion and explain the reasons that she gives for having that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 4. Read a short passage and then listen to part of a lecture on the same topic. Then listen for a question about them. After you hear the question, you have 30 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now read the passage about stress.
You have 45 seconds to complete it. Please begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class. The professor is talking about an experiment.
Let me tell you about a classic experiment on rats. I think it was first done in the early 70s by Weiss and reported in the Scientific American. Anyway, the rats were divided randomly into 3 groups. Rats in the first group were given shocks, but just before the shock was induced, they received a warning in the form of a tone. The second group of rats was also given shocks, but this group didn't receive the warning tone. And the final control group received no shocks, but they were exposed to the same warning tone as the first group. After a few weeks, the rats were examined, and the animals that had received shocks with no warning were already showing severe signs of stomach ulcers. The other 2 groups of rats showed little or no instance of ulcers. According to Weiss, the experiment confirmed that unexpected events are more stressful than those that can be predicted. In related experiments, there was also evidence that even a small amount of control over the circumstances surrounding the stress can lower the negative effects. When rats were allowed to select their own rest and feeding times, they experienced less physical damage than did rats that received the same amount of rest and feeding at times that were selected for them.
Explain the causes of stress and relate them to the experiment with rats.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 5. Listen to a short conversation. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and her friend.
What are you going to do for the project?
I don't know. I was hoping you could help me think of something.
Well, you're such a good artist, you could talk about watercolor while you're doing one in front of the class. That'd be totally awesome. If I were you, that's what I'd do.
Maybe. But what if I make a mistake in front of everyone?
Come on, you're really talented. Besides, you wouldn't have to do much preparation beforehand.
True. And it fits in with what we've been talking about in class.
Yeah. Or how about this? You could bring in a photograph, a pencil drawing, and a watercolor of the same subject. Something simple so it wouldn't take so much time to do, like a flower. Then you could show the advantages and disadvantages of working with different materials.
I could do that one ahead of time.
You could, but remember, it'd take a lot more time.
Gee, thanks. I'll have to think about it, but these are both really good options.
Describe the woman's problem and the two suggestions that her friend makes about how to handle it. What do you think the woman should do, and why?
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Number 6. Listen to part of a lecture. Then listen for a question about it. After you hear the question, you have 20 seconds to prepare and 60 seconds to record your answer.
Now listen to part of a lecture in a geology class. The professor is discussing caverns.
Okay, as you'll recall, caves form in limestone when acidic groundwater follows some kind of weakness in the rocks. Now, the rock formations in a cavern, that's the technical name that we use for a cave. The rock formations there are of two kinds, stalactites and stalagmites. Both of these formations are water that contains dissolved minerals that accumulate and build deposits. But stalactites hang down from the ceiling of a cavern, and stalagmites protrude up from the floor of the cavern. Well, these words sound a lot alike, and this can be confusing. So I always tell my students to remember that there is a T in stalactites, and the T has a tail that hangs down just like the stalactites that hang down from the ceiling of the cave. But there is an M in stalagmites, and the points on an M stick up like the stalagmites that protrude up from the ground in a cave. And if that doesn't work for you, another way to remember the difference is that stalactite has a C in it, and so does the word ceiling, whereas stalagmite has G in it, and so does the word ground. So stalactites drip down from the ceiling, and stalagmites build up from the ground. So with these little tricks for remembering the difference, I expect you all to get this right on the next quiz.
Using the main points and examples from the lecture, describe the two kinds of rock formations in a cavern, and explain how the professor helps his students remember the difference between the two.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep. Model Test 5 action.
First, read the passage and take notes. Now listen to a lecture on the same topic as the passage that you have just read.
Although it's claimed that competition in the classroom plays an important role in academic achievement, today we'll challenge the assumptions that competition is good for students. First of all, competition supposedly provides motivation, but in well-documented research, competitive classrooms can cause high degrees of performance anxiety, which actually interferes with learning and impedes the goal of motivation. Increased instances of cheating, fear of failure, antagonism among students, and low self-esteem also tend to increase in highly competitive educational settings. A second assumption is that competition increases productivity, but in an analysis of 122 studies on this topic, Alfie Kohn found that cooperation promoted higher productivity than competition in about half of the studies, and 25% of the studies didn't discriminate between productivity in cooperative and competitive cases. In numerous studies since, the benefits of cooperative learning, or the structuring of groups to work together in the classroom, has confirmed the increase in productivity that accompanies a focus on group goals. The assumption that competition is fun may have been true in the past when emphasis was placed on the process, that is, playing the game. But in contemporary society, the emphasis seems to have changed. Children are so dedicated to winning the game that the spontaneous fun is often lost in the contest. Even sports competitions have become all about the outcome, and losers don't have nearly as much fun as winners. So here's my solution. Why not retain all of the good aspects of competition by allowing students to compete against themselves? Instead of a situation in which one person wins because he's read the most books, everyone wins because each child has read more books this term than he or she did last term. See what I mean?
Summarize the main points in the lecture, and then explain how they cast doubt on the ideas in the reading passage.
Model Test 5 answers.
Example answer for independent speaking question 1. A tourist attraction.
Although a case could be made for showing a tourist the beautiful mountain region or the historic capital city in my country, I'd probably take a tourist to my home, because living with a family would give this visitor a perspective about my country that few tourists have. Shopping, eating meals together, interacting and participating in the usual everyday activities, attending religious services, and visiting friends in their homes. This would let the visitor live in my culture for a while. I think this is more impressive than taking photos of places, because you can see all of the usual tourist attractions in videos or magazines, but you can't understand how people live unless you live with them.
Example answer for independent speaking question 2. Success.
I think it's important to set goals and work hard to achieve them. For one thing, goals help you think clearly about what you're doing. By identifying goals, you get organized. Another thing's the advantage of sharing goals with people who can help you. If others know what you're trying to do, sometimes they give you advice or assistance. As for good luck, I agree that a lucky opportunity or a chance meeting with a person who can help you is sometimes a key to success. But unless you know where you're going and what you want to achieve, you might not even recognize a lucky opportunity. So in my opinion, the best way to succeed is to know what you want and work to create your own good fortune. Then, if luck shines on you, you'll just reach your goal sooner.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 3. Auto registration.
To park on campus, students have to buy permits for each vehicle. They cost $20. The woman doesn't oppose the fee, but she believes that it should cover all the vehicles that a student might need to use. She uses a personal example from last term when she had to drive her husband's car and she got a ticket even though she had a paid permit for her own car. So her solutions to pay for parking on campus and then display the permit on the vehicle that the student happens to be driving that day. That way, if there are several cars in the family, the student can drive any of them using the same parking permit. In other words, she thinks that the $20 registration should be for the student who needs the parking space, not for the vehicle that the student's driving.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 4. Stress.
Stress is caused by changes in the environment that require people to adjust to new circumstances. It's interesting that these new conditions don't have to be negative. For example, you'd expect to have stress after a divorce or a health problem, but even moving to a new house or going on a trip can be stressful. Okay, in the experiment by Weiss, one group of rats was shocked after they heard a tone, so they knew that the shock was going to happen. Another group of rats heard the tone but didn't get the shock, and the other group received shocks at random without warning. So, the rats that received shocks without warning, they were the ones who developed ulcers, but the other two groups had fewer ulcers or none at all. And this research proved that unexpected experiences are more stressful than those we can predict. Additional investigations also showed that even a little bit of control, like choosing times to rest or eat, could reduce stress.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 5. Art project.
The woman's trying to decide what to do for her project, and her friend makes a couple of suggestions. He encourages her to paint a watercolor in front of the class while she's giving a talk about watercolor. The advantage of that project is she wouldn't have to prepare very much before the presentation. The other idea is to show 3 different versions of one subject, like a flower, in watercolor, a pencil sketch, and maybe a photograph. She could talk about the pluses and minuses of working in each of the 3 media. The advantage of the second project is that she could prepare it before class, but the problem is it'd be more time-consuming. I think she should go with the second idea because she seemed nervous about doing a spontaneous watercolor, and even though it'd take more time, showing the 3 pieces of art would be less stressful, and the advanced preparation might influence the professor to give her a better grade.
Example answer for integrated speaking question 6. Caverns.
The rock formations in caverns are made up of water that's saturated with dissolved minerals. As they drip and deposit themselves in the cave, you'll notice some of them hang from the ceiling and some of them grow up from the floor. The terms for each of these deposits are so similar that the professor suggests some tricks to help keep them straight. Stalactite has the letter T in it, which reminds students of a tail that hangs down. But stalagmite has the letter M in it, which brings to mind 2 points that stick up. He also points out that stalactite has a C in it, like the word ceiling. And stalactites drip down from the ceiling, but stalagmite has a G in it, like the word ground. And stalagmites grow up from the ground. So these memory aids, they help us recall that stalactites are the rock formations that grow down from the cavern, and stalagmites are the ones that grow up from the floor.